Julian Carter walked through the sleek marble hallways of Sterling Corp, trying his best not to let the grandeur of the building overwhelm him. He was used to moving through power broker spaces, but Sterling Corp's reign over the city's financial empire was different, imposing, all-encompassing. It made him feel small in a way he wasn't used to. As he stepped into the lobby, it took him a moment to notice the man standing near the reception desk, his back to Julian. The man had an aura of authority that nearly suffocated the room. It was as though the world bent around him, and that alone was enough to remind anyone in his presence who held the power. Damien Sterling turned, his dark eyes locking with Julian's. Julian took in a deep breath, walking toward him with a sense of duty, eyes focused. And then he spilled his coffee onto Damien's pristine suit. A collective gasp seemed to go through the room. But Julian only raised an eyebrow, unapologetically meeting the alpha's gaze. "If you can afford that suit, I'm sure you can afford a new one," Julian quipped, a little too sarcastically for the occasion. Damien didn't flinch. He just looked at Julian, eyes dark with amusement and something far sharper. "Interesting," Damien said coolly before stepping forward, towering over Julian with an energy that left the younger man momentarily off balance. A new dynamic began unfolding. Neither of them could possibly know it yet, but in that moment, their fates had crossed and neither was likely to leave the other's orbit anytime soon. The weeks that followed were an open battleground. Julian worked as Sterling Corp's new financial strategist, pushing against the established power structures Damien had built. He saw the way others deferred to the alpha, idolized him, believed that Damien's word was a law that couldn't be questioned. But Julian wasn't like them. In every meeting, Julian presented bold alternatives that worked, that challenged Damien's conventional methods. He didn't bow to the unspoken command of being an Omega, the submission that was expected in a room like this. He was determined to make a mark on the world in his own way. Damien, on the other hand, didn't take kindly to being undermined. Yet, instead of punishing Julian, as others might have expected, he found himself fascinated by the defiance. One night, long after everyone had left, only Damien and Julian remained. The tension between them was palpable, thick with the weight of unspoken desire and unacknowledged conflict. "You think your ideas will work?" Damien asked, crossing the room to stand next to Julian, whose back was pressed against the glass of the high-rise. "I know they will," Julian answered confidently, his voice full of challenge. "You should try listening sometime." Damien's eyes darkened as he loomed closer, until Julian could feel the heat coming from the other man. No words passed between them. Just a single magnetic pull that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with something else. "You like to test me, don't you?" Damien said, his voice low, almost a growl. Julian stood firm. "I test people who think they're untouchable." That was it, the first crack, the first moment when their roles began to blur. The evening had been typical of any corporate gala: bright lights, champagne flowing, rich investors networking, and so much thinly veiled competition. Yet, none of it had felt real to Julian. He was just there to mingle, to maintain his cover, to survive the night without being swept into anything unnecessary. That was, until he found himself standing beside another alpha. They talked about strategies and numbers, and Julian couldn't help but laugh, a free, unburdened laugh at the latest joke the man had told. It was nothing more than light-hearted conversation. Then he saw the flash of Damien's eyes from across the room. It wasn't just the alpha's usual intensity. There was something more now, something dangerous creeping into Damien's expression as he scanned the two of them talking. His gaze narrowed in, drawn entirely to the interaction. Damien couldn't take it anymore. He cut through the crowd with relentless speed. Julian didn't even realize what had happened until he found himself outside, standing in the cool night air, a firm grip tightening around his wrist, pulling him away. "What's your game, Carter?" Damien's voice was low, but the force behind the words made it clear that nothing was out of his control. The balcony overlooked the entire city, but in that moment, Julian's world narrowed to just Damien. Julian tried to resist, tried to defend himself, but there was something undeniable about how Damien's presence anchored him to that space, close, urgent, controlled. "You let him touch you," Damien said, his voice hard. Julian turned, pushing his chest out with defiance, but as he opened his mouth to speak, Damien closed the distance and pressed his lips to Julian's. There was no warning. No build-up, just pure, primal need. The kiss was not tender. It was violent, aggressive, and demanding. And Julian, despite everything inside him telling him to push back, responded. He knew the moment it happened he was in deeper than he ever expected. When they pulled away, both gasping for air, Julian stared at Damien, eyes wide. I am not yours. Damien leaned back with a calm smirk. Keep telling yourself that, Julian. But it was a lie. They both knew it. Weeks passed, but the tension only deepened. Their work interactions were filled with silent stares, heated discussions, and unspoken tension in the air that no one but they could feel. But then the moment Julian had feared most came too soon. His Omega side roared, and his suppressants failed him. He felt it happen, the heat rising like a flame. His body went into overdrive and he was caught off guard. He thought he could control it, but it wasn't so easy now. At the height of it, Damien found him first, tracking his scent through the building. When Julian found him standing in the doorway, something cracked inside him. He wanted to run. He didn't want to be weak, to be claimed. Yet, in Damien's eyes, there was only patience. You don't have to fight me, Damien said, voice soft. It was gentle, a man offering sanctuary instead of domination. Julian fell back into the office chair, dizzy with desire. What was happening to him? Why didn't he feel angry? Why didn't he want to fight the Alpha this time? He clenched his jaw, but his heart skipped when Damien slowly moved forward. He was ready to fight. He could push Damien away, tell him to leave, control the situation. But then again, did he want to? Damien kneeled down, stopping mere inches away from him. The last fight in Julian was slipping away, dissolving with the way Damien's presence felt so safe, so right. I don't own you, Julian. But I will be with you if you'll let me. Julian exhaled sharply. I'm already yours. Weeks passed as both of them danced around the inevitable, but Julian couldn't take it anymore. He couldn't resist the magnet pulling him toward Damien, the unspoken connection between them. And as the days dragged on, he realized he didn't want to fight it anymore. He arrived at Damien's penthouse one stormy evening, determined to stop running, stop denying what had been growing inside him from the moment he met him. Damien opened the door, a slow smile creeping over his lips. There was no anger now, just recognition of what they had been circling all along. Want me? Damien asked. His voice, raw yet soft, caught Julian off guard. Julian's heart raced, his hands trembling as he said, Prove it. Damien reached forward, slowly, with utmost care. I'm already yours, Damien said, his voice almost a whisper. And this time, there were no games, no control. Just a single moment of perfect clarity between them. Damien closed the space between them, their lips crashing together in a kiss. It wasn't forceful, it was mutual. It was real. And for the first time, there were no lies between them. The weeks following their declaration were filled with an electric, undeniable tension. Yet, Julian couldn't help but feel like there was still something lurking between them, something neither of them was truly addressing. Their professional dynamic shifted, too. People began noticing. Can we talk? Damien's voice, deep and commanding, broke him from his thoughts one evening after a long day at work. Julian had spent most of the day reviewing a proposal with Damien, their professional relationship requiring boundaries they could barely maintain anymore. The words Damien spoke now made his pulse quicken, the weight behind the question far more intimate than anything they had shared in the past weeks. Julian leaned back in his chair, keeping his voice light. About. Damien closed the distance between them and placed a hand on Julian's desk. His eyes were darkened with something that felt dangerous, yet sincere. Us. His voice softened for the first time, raw, sincere, and almost vulnerable. Julian's breath caught in his throat, but he straightened his posture and forced a calm exterior. I thought we were past this, Damien. We've already. Damien cut him off, his thumb tracing lightly across Julian's desk. I'm not talking about business. I'm talking about you and me. What happens next? Julian's chest tightened. The way Damien said you and me felt like a different promise, one filled with more power than Julian was ready to face. They had crossed a line, he knew that. They could no longer keep pretending they were separate. There was no more control, no more restraint. And that terrified Julian. Yet, in the next breath, it thrilled him too. I don't know. Damien tilted his head slightly, reading every flicker of doubt and emotion in Julian's eyes. And that's okay, he said quietly, his voice unwavering, yet softer than Julian had ever heard. Because you're mine, Julian, whether you like it or not. Before Julian could protest, Damien's lips brushed his jaw lightly, a touch almost tender and yet full of intention. There was nothing sexual about it. It was about ownership, about claiming him again. Julian shuddered but didn't pull back. Was he resisting? Or simply surrendering? He didn't know anymore. The emotional friction between them began to test Julian in ways he hadn't expected. The possessiveness Damien held over him seeped into every moment. Julian didn't belong just to himself anymore, he belonged to Damien. And for someone who was once fiercely independent, this truth unsettled him. His every step became something that mattered because with every movement he made, Damien was watching. Every glance, every smile, every decision. Nothing was the same now. Julian knew it couldn't stay this way, too intense, too consuming. Yet the more they collided, the more they pulled back only to be drawn closer. There was no escape from this pull. He was anchored by Damien, and Damien in turn appeared to welcome the weight. But it wasn't always easy. As their relationship intensified, their personalities began to clash. Damien pushed Julian, demanding more, not just in bed but in life. In the office, too. Damien was ruthless, used to getting exactly what he wanted, and Julian fought back at every turn, not out of defiance for the relationship, but out of dread. He didn't want to lose himself in someone else. Yet, for some reason he couldn't help but give in. One evening, Julian stormed into Damien's penthouse after a disagreement at the office. "You don't get it, I'm not your toy." Julian's chest heaved, his words slashing the air. He felt it, that terrifying wave of frustration pushing against the quiet desire he felt. The desire to be seen, truly seen. Damien, watching him, his dark eyes never leaving his face, waited. He knew better than to push, yet Julian's raw words stung deeply. "I never took you as a toy," Damien said quietly, leaning in slowly, his voice low. "But there are rules, Julian. You can try to escape them. But you won't. You'll come back to me, every single time." Before Julian could answer, Damien pressed forward and kissed him deeply, fully. The kiss was both a claim and a promise. Yet, even though Julian had told him to leave, part of him didn't want him to. The passion they shared wasn't simply about sex, it was about possessing each other. Damien whispered against his lips, "I'm never letting you go." Things had reached a fever pitch, with Damien becoming more possessive while Julian struggled with his sense of autonomy. He was constantly battling two forces, the man who owned him, body and soul, and the man who wanted to retain his freedom. But it wasn't just control anymore, it was love. Julian hadn't realized it until late one night, as he sat alone in his apartment after yet another heated argument. He was trying to distract himself from the turmoil, from the gnawing feeling in his chest. But there was no denying it. He thought about Damien, about how the alpha made him feel alive, seen, valued in a way no one ever had. Julian had long been terrified of depending on someone else. Yet, as he sat there, his body trembling in the silent comfort of the apartment, he felt it. The recognition in his heart. He had fallen for Damien. In some twisted way, it had always been Damien's power and dominance that Julian craved the most. What terrified him, he now longed for. To belong, to be seen, to be loved. Julian ran a hand through his hair and sighed softly, realizing that Damien hadn't been trying to trap him. Damien wasn't an enemy. He was everything Julian had needed and yet had always fought against. The world outside had long since faded by the time Damien pulled Julian back to him once again. Their meetings once filled with terse interactions and fire forged a new, irrevocable path between them. This time, there were no games, only the truth of their connection. "You're mine," Damien whispered, pulling Julian close. "And I'm yours. This is it. We're going to be together." And for the first time, Julian didn't fight back. Instead, he surrendered. He chose him, choosing this passion, this life, and this unexpected love between them. It had always been destiny, and Julian finally realized it. They kissed again, slowly, tenderly. And Julian didn't need control anymore. He just needed Damien.